Hi there, welcome to my long-awaited tutorial entitled Decently Exposed, which, as you know, I advertised some time ago using this triangle. I've used the triangle for a reason. I call it the triangle of exposure, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one that calls it that. Correct exposure is often, but not always, a personal choice. Exposure, or the lack of it, can be used to create a mood or an atmosphere. For instance, I think that this picture sets a particular mood, although technically it's underexposed. The same picture, with a better exposure, for me, falls short in the mood category and becomes just another picture. A correct exposure is made up of three interrelated elements, hence the use of a triangle. The first of which is aperture size. This is determined by the iris in the lens that is fitted to your camera. The aperture determines how much light enters your camera when you press the shutter release button. A wide aperture will allow more light to enter your camera than will a small one. The second element is the shutter speed, which is the amount of time that the shutter, a kind of screen that sits behind the lens, will stay open when you press the shutter release button. Again, the longer it remains open, the more light enters the camera. The final element is the ISO number. The ISO number determines the sensitivity or amplification factor of the sensor that sits behind both the lens and the shutter. You may have seen the term ISO in relation to any one of many international quality standards. The ISO, or ISO, is an organization which is responsible for ensuring that the ISO settings on my camera and the ISO settings on your camera are the same. That's their responsibility. We could of course call it a sensitivity number or any other arbitrary term, but the term ISO has been around since the days of film, and it's of course gotten stuck there. Back to our triangle. Let's say that a correct exposure has a definite value, and for argument's sake, let's give it the value of 6. The relationships between the three elements are fixed, which means that changing one of them will necessarily force a change in one or both of the others, in order to achieve the same level of exposure. Let's give each of them a value of 2. Let's now change one of them from 2 to 1. In order to achieve the same exposure, we need a sum of 6, which means that we need to change one of the other elements to 3, or both of them to 2.5. Now what happens when we change those values is the real secret of photography, and their interrelationships can be used to give a dynamic to your photographs. Firstly, what happens when you change the aperture? The aperture is the element that is responsible for what is known as the depth of field. You've seen those pictures where the subject is sharply in focus, but the background is way out of focus. You may have thought that it was done with Photoshop, which, of course it can be, but it's far easier to achieve such an effect in camera. A small aperture will ensure a larger depth of field, which is good for group photographs, and a larger aperture will shrink the area that is in focus. In extreme cases, it's possible that the nose of a subject can be in focus, but that their eyes are not. The next element is shutter speed, which is responsible for freezing the motion that your camera can see. This is useful for stopping the action in sports photos. Stopping a fast-moving object requires a high shutter speed, whilst a slow shutter speed will allow even a leisurely walk to be blurred, as in this picture over here. The final element is the ISO number. This number shows how much electronic amplification has been applied to the signal coming from the camera's imaging sensor. High ISO settings will allow you to take pictures in low light conditions. The drawback here, of course, is that the higher the ISO number, the more electronic noise will be seen in your picture. Modern cameras are capable of taking pictures with very high ISO settings that were unheard of in the age of film. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Please like and subscribe. Be well.
Hades.com.